The valley didn't echo. That was the first thing that unsettled them. In every training exercise, in every simulation, in every briefing room projection of what a long-range engagement sounds like, there is an echo. A crack that rolls off the hillsides and gives you something to triangulate, something to turn toward, something to report up the radio chain with a direction and a confidence. There was no echo. There was just the sound of a man sitting down very suddenly in the middle of a dirt road, and then the silence that followed, and then the shouting. His name was Thomas Ward. Not that anyone in the valley knew that. Not that anyone would have been looking for a man by that name in the dry, elevated terrain of a region that most maps labeled with words that meant, roughly translated, the place before the place that matters. He had been operating under a different identifier for 11 days. He would be operating under it for however many more it took, which was a number he did not think about because thinking about it served no function. He was 41 years old. He had eyes that his mother had once described as the color of old ice, not the romantic kind of ice, not the glacier kind, but the ice in a freezer that's been there so long it's gone slightly gray and entirely reliable. He had a scar along his right forearm that he'd stopped noticing 14 years ago. He had a resting heart rate of 52 beats per minute under ordinary conditions, and a resting heart rate of 54 beats per minute in conditions that were not ordinary at all. He had been lying in the same position for 9 hours and 40 minutes. The ground beneath him was dry and rocky and indifferent to human discomfort, in the way that this particular part of the world had perfected over millennia. There were loose stones under his left hip that he'd noticed about 40 minutes in and stopped noticing by hour 2. The sun had moved across the sky in the slow, absolute way that the sun moves when you're watching it, and the shadows had shifted around him, and he'd adjusted incrementally. The way water finds its own level, not dramatically, not visibly, just continuously, quietly, in a way that anyone watching the hillside would not have been able to point at and name. Which was, of course, the entire point. He breathed through his nose, long, slow, unhurried cycles. His spotter, a younger man named Yates who was lying 2 meters to his left, and had the patience of someone twice his age, and the instincts of someone who'd been born for exactly this kind of work, had not spoken in 47 minutes. This was not unusual. This was, in fact, the most important quality Yates possessed, not his eyes, not his rangefinder, not his ability to calculate wind drift and temperature variance and Coriolis adjustment with a speed that most people used computers for. His ability to be quiet, to wait, to understand, at a cellular level, that this kind of work was entirely incompatible with hurry. Thomas had been waiting for a specific vehicle to appear at a specific point on a specific road. The intelligence that had placed him here was 3 layers removed from anything he was cleared to see the full context of. What he had was a grid reference, a time window, a target description, and a range that had been verified by 3 separate analysts, and still made the junior officer who briefed him blink twice before reading it aloud. 3,200 meters, just over 2 miles. The officer had read it, and then looked up from the paper with the particular expression of a man who wants to say something skeptical, but has been trained not to say skeptical things to people who outrank him in every way that mattered, even if the org chart didn't technically reflect it. Thomas had looked at the range figure on the paper for approximately 1 second and then asked for the atmospheric data. Not, is this achievable? Not, are you sure about that number? Just give me the atmospheric data. He was using a rifle that did not officially belong to any inventory he was part of. It had been built over the course of several months by a man in a workshop in a location that Thomas knew and would not repeat, chambered in a cartridge that was not standard issue anything, fitted with a suppressor that reduced the sound signature to something that, at range, was indistinguishable from the ambient noise of a wind that was already moving through the valley at irregular intervals. He had fired this rifle at distances approaching 2 miles on 3 previous occasions in field conditions, not range conditions, not the clean, flat, controlled stillness of a test facility. Field conditions, which meant weather that didn't cooperate and ground that wasn't level and intelligence that was always slightly incomplete, and a body that had been awake for longer than any study would recommend, and a mind that had to hold all of those variables simultaneously. Like a man spinning plates, except the plates were made of consequences. He had connected on all 3 occasions. He did not think of this as exceptional. He thought of it as the result of roughly 22 years of accumulated, grinding, unremarkable practice. Of cold mornings lying on ranges when everyone else had gone inside. Of reading obsessively the work of the men who'd come before him, not the celebrated ones, not the ones whose names got used in headlines, but the quiet ones. The ones who'd written technical manuals and study papers and unpublished notes that circulated among a very small community of people who understood what they were reading. Of making mistakes and understanding why they were mistakes and making different mistakes and understanding those too. Mastery, he believed, was not a state you arrived at. It was a direction you kept moving in. The moment you thought you'd arrived, you were already drifting. He adjusted his position by a fraction. Yates noted it without looking at him, tracking the subtle shift in Thomas's breathing pattern the way a sailor reads a change in the water. "Wind is dropping," Yates said, barely audible. His voice had no more volume than breath. Thomas had already felt it. The grasses 20 meters ahead of them, which had been moving in a consistent left-to-right pattern all morning, had slowed. Not stopped, but slowed. He made a mental note. He waited. The vehicle appeared 12 minutes later than the intelligence window had suggested it would, which was an improvement over most intelligence windows, which were wrong by margins, significantly larger than 12 minutes. It came from the north end of the valley road, moving at a pace that suggested either confidence or carelessness, and in this region at this particular historical moment. Those 2 things were frequently indistinguishable from one another. Thomas watched it through his scope. The scope was doing several things simultaneously that scopes were not doing 20 years ago. It was calculating, adjusting, feeding him data in the periphery of his visual field that his eyes had learned to read without his conscious mind having to interpret them. The way an experienced driver reads the road without thinking about reading the road. He breathed in, he breathed out, he was thinking about nothing. This sounds impossible. It is, in fact, the hardest skill he'd ever developed. The human mind is not built for nothing. It is built for narrative, for projection, for anxiety, for retrospect. It fills silence with sound and emptiness with furniture. Making the mind go genuinely empty, not distracted, not suppressed, but genuinely quiet, was the work of years. Was the thing that separated people who could do this from people who could almost do this. He was thinking about nothing. The vehicle slowed at the intersection he'd been told it would slow at. "Range confirmed," Yates murmured. 3207 meters, Thomas breathed. He made 3 micro-adjustments over the next 30 seconds that Yates tracked without comment, because they were exactly the adjustments that the data called for. The wind had dropped further. The temperature at his position was different from the temperature at the midpoint of the round's flight path, which was different again from the temperature at the target. He was doing arithmetic in his nervous system rather than his brain at this point. The numbers had been internalized so completely that his body was doing the calculation. He breathed out very slowly, and at the bottom of that breath, in the half-second where his lungs were empty and his body was briefly at its most still, he pressed the trigger. The suppressor did its work. There was a sound. It was not a crack. It was more like a heavy pressure, a thud with edges. Something you would hear if you were within 100 meters and were specifically listening for it. And even then, you would need to know what you were listening for. The round was in the air. At the speeds involved, this was not instantaneous. There was time, a strange, suspended interval during which nothing had happened yet and everything already had. Thomas held his position completely, his eyes still behind the scope, tracking. Yates was watching through a separate optic. The round had traveled approximately 1,000 meters when Yates said, very quietly, "Good shot." He said it before it hit. He could read the flight. The round traveled the remaining 2,200 meters and arrived. The target sat down in the road. The radio traffic started within 90 seconds. Thomas and Yates were already moving. They had not run. Running creates sound, disturbs ground cover, leaves patterns that can be found and followed. They moved with the efficient, low, continuous motion of people who'd practiced extraction from this kind of position, until it was as natural as walking out of a room. Their gear was already configured for movement. Nothing was left behind. Nothing except the depression in the earth where Thomas had lain for 9 hours and 40 minutes, and the afternoon sun would erase that within an hour. Below them, in the valley, the radio traffic was becoming desperate. They couldn't hear the specific words from the hillside. But Thomas had been in enough situations to know the frequency of that kind of communication, the rhythm of it, the particular pace of transmissions that have no useful information to report but are being sent anyway because the act of transmitting gives the sender the feeling of doing something. Where did that shot come from? He knew without hearing it that some version of that question was being asked, was being shouted into radios, cross-referenced against topographic maps. Relayed up chains of command that stretched from that valley, road to offices with air conditioning and whiteboards, and men in clean uniforms, who would receive the information with a stillness that concealed alarm. They had no answer for it. This was not arrogance on his part, it was simply physics. At 3,200 meters in the terrain he'd chosen, with the equipment he was using, there was no signature left to find. There was no muzzle flash. There was no audible report that could be triangulated. There was no indication of direction. There was a result, and there was a silence, and between those two things was a gap that no amount of frantic radio traffic was going to bridge. He had picked this position 11 days ago. Not yesterday, not that morning. 11 days ago, when he'd first been given the grid reference for the target's probable route. He'd walked out with a topographic chart and a compass, and covered the surrounding high ground on foot over 4 days, systematically, methodically, eliminating positions that were too exposed. Too close, too far, too loud, too soft, too dependent on conditions he couldn't control. He'd found this position on the afternoon of the 4th day. He'd lain in it for 2 hours. He'd taken atmospheric readings. He'd noted the drainage pattern of the ground, which would tell him how rain changed the terrain's sound absorption quality. He'd noted the angle of the sun at different hours, which told him when his position would be silhouetted and when it would be absorbed into shadow. Then he'd walked away from it and not returned until the night before. Yates materialized at his left elbow as they crossed the secondary ridge and dropped below the line of sight from the valley. They increased their pace slightly, not dramatically, just enough. 11 days of prep, Yates said, when they'd put enough distance and elevation between themselves and the valley. It wasn't a question. It was something closer to an acknowledgement. Thomas didn't respond immediately. They moved for another 2 minutes in silence. 9.5 days of it is just waiting, Thomas said finally. That's the hard part, Yates said. That's the only part, Thomas said. They were extracted that evening, not dramatically. Not from a rooftop under fire with a rope ladder and a helicopter with its lights off. Extracted the way this kind of work usually ended, which was quietly through 3 vehicles, 2 border crossings, and a safe house that smelled like diesel and old cooking oil, and the accumulated tension of the people who'd used it before them. Thomas showered, he ate. He slept for 11 hours in the way that only a particular kind of exhaustion allows, not peacefully, but completely, like a machine that has been powered down rather than rested. In the morning there were debriefs, formal ones. A table, a recording device, men with notebooks who asked detailed questions about conditions and decisions in a tone that was entirely clinical. Because clinical was what this setting required, and everyone in the room understood that. He answered every question precisely, not tersely, precisely. There is a difference. Terseness omits. Precision includes everything relevant and nothing that isn't. At one point during the debrief, a senior officer, a man Thomas had met twice before in different countries under different circumstances, a man who had the quality of someone who had grown into his seriousness, the way a tree grows into a shape over years, because of the specific pressures it encountered, looked up from his notes. He said the ranging data was confirmed at 3207 meters post-event. He paused. He looked at Thomas. "I want to make sure what I'm looking at here is what I think I'm looking at." Thomas said, "What do you think you're looking at?" The officer held his gaze for a moment. "A first-round hit. At over 2 miles. In field conditions, including a variable crosswind that our own atmospheric team logged at changing between 4 and 11 kilometers per hour during the window." Thomas said nothing. The officer said, "I've been in this business for 31 years. I've seen a lot of debrief sheets. I've read the records, the verified ones." He tapped his pen against the notebook once. "This goes on a very short list." Thomas looked at the table for a moment. He wasn't being falsely modest. He wasn't performing humility. He was thinking about Yates calling the shot before it hit. He was thinking about 11 days on a hillside. He was thinking about the cold mornings on ranges when everyone else had gone inside, and the technical manuals, and the different mistakes understood, and the accumulated, grinding years of it. He said Yates read the flight. He called it good before the hit. The officer looked at him. "Put his name in it," Thomas said, "not as a formality. He earned the debrief credit." The officer made a note without being asked twice about it. He made it slowly, in the way of a man who recognized something worth recording. The debrief continued for 2 more hours. At the end, after the recording device had been switched off and the notebooks had been closed and the junior analysts had left the room, the senior officer sat back in his chair and looked at Thomas in a way that was different from the debrief look. More human, more direct. He said, "There's a group, task organized, standing up in about 6 months. The mandate is specifically long-range interdiction at distances that current doctrine says are not viable for deliberate operations." Thomas looked at him. "Current doctrine," he said, "is catching up." The officer almost smiled. "Not quite, something adjacent to it. We'd want you involved in writing the new doctrine," he said, "not just executing it." Writing it? This was significant. Thomas understood why it was significant, not because of rank or recognition, because doctrine was what the next generation of these men would read, would train from, would carry into positions on hillsides that hadn't been identified yet, in valleys that didn't yet have names on anyone's maps, lying next to spotters who hadn't met them yet, waiting for windows that hadn't opened yet. Doctrine was what outlasted you. He thought about that for a moment. 6 months, he said. Approximately. I'll need to see the structural mandate before I commit. I'd expect nothing less. Thomas stood. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He put it on. He said, "When the opposing reports come in from the valley, and they will, because these things always generate an incident report on both sides, there's going to be language in there about the shot being unattributable, about the direction being impossible to determine." The officer nodded. That's not a gap in their intelligence, Thomas said. That's a feature. Leave it unexplained. Let them keep asking where it came from. He paused at the door. The time they spend on that question is time they're not spending on other things. He left. 3 days later, in a different country, Thomas Ward sat at a table outside a cafe that had metal chairs and a view of a narrow street and coffee that was very strong and slightly too sweet and entirely perfect in the way of things that don't try to be anything other than what they are. He had a notebook in front of him, not a tactical one. A small, soft-covered notebook that he carried in his jacket's inner pocket, in which he wrote things that were not reports, not debrief answers, not doctrine. Things that were harder to categorize. Observations about the nature of distance, about the relationship between patience and outcome, about what it meant to do a thing so thoroughly and so quietly that the absence of your presence in the doing of it became the whole point. He drank his coffee. He wrote one line that morning, in the middle of an otherwise empty page, which was this: "The most complete work leaves no trace of how it was done." He looked at it for a moment. He closed the notebook. A dog was sleeping under the table next to his. A woman 2 tables away was reading something on her phone and frowning at it slightly, in the good-natured way of someone encountering information that mildly contradicts something they believed. A child went past on a bicycle that was too big for him, concentrating enormously on the wheel ahead, entirely unconcerned with anything beyond the next 3 feet of cobblestone. Thomas Ward watched the street. He was thinking about nothing. He was very good at it by now. There is something worth considering. In the long, unrecorded space between actions that history notices and actions that history is never shown. The distance of 3,200 meters is not, in any ordinary human context, a meaningful number. It is an abstraction. It is a quantity that the mind accepts without processing, the way you accept the stated age of a mountain, but stand somewhere, pick a point, count to 3,200. Feel the size of that silence. That is the space a man held perfectly still inside. That is the space he understood, intimately, the way a craftsman understands the material he works with. That is the space through which he sent something, once, with a precision that defied the comfortable edges of what trained military minds had agreed was possible. And in that valley, for hours afterward, men with radios asked each other the same question. Triangulated, estimated, disagreed, asked again. They got no answer, not because the answer didn't exist. Because the man who held it had already walked away. Some capabilities don't announce themselves. They wait. They prepare. They breathe, very slowly at the bottom of an exhale, in the half-second where the body is most still. And then they're already done before the world knows to start wondering.